Okay, my name is Teresa Aviles, and I run the Isidro Aviles Memorial Chapter of the November Coalition in New York City. I started this chapter in memory of my son, Isidro, who passed away in federal prison while serving a long, harsh, unjust, mandatory minimum sentence for an alleged drug conspiracy. So when my son was first arrested, he called me and he told me that a young man had gotten him into, to use his words, some deep shit. So I said, well, what happened? Well, I was arrested for drugs. So I said, well, how much drugs did you have? And he said, none. So I was so happy because I just knew that he was going to go to court the next day and the judge was going to hear that he had no drugs, $52 and a watch and a ring and a beeper, and he would be let go. Well, my happiness was short-lived. The next day when we got to court, he was held without bail, and the reason that they used was that he was dangerous and he was a risk of flight. And I think it's important to say that my son he was 26 years old at the time. He had, besides for a couple of parking tickets and a moving violation or two, he was never in any real trouble. He had never been convicted of a crime in his life. And the nightmare just kept getting worse and worse until finally he was sentenced to 23 years in federal prison for an alleged drug conspiracy where there was no drugs. I got a call one night from an anonymous female who said that my son had passed out approximately 10 days earlier in a prison shower room, and that he had been taken to the infirmary where he was given some aspirin, and that he was brought back to his cell where he was unable to care for himself. He wasn't even able to get to the bathroom by himself, and that she said the other inmates were helping him. You know, he was unable to eat, he couldn't get to the bathroom, and she suggested that I call there the next morning, and to use her words, she said that the big shots would be there that day. So I immediately called the Bureau of Prisons down in White Deer, Pennsylvania, and they told me that my son was fine. And I said, well, how can you know immediately that one inmate is fine when you have 1,400 inmates in this institution? And they seemed to be more concerned about how I knew how many inmates were there, you know, instead of being concerned about my son. So the next morning, my daughter and I drove to White Deer, and as we were going in, we were met by the warden, the assistant warden, a couple of social workers, and they had obviously been there to see Isidro, and they seemed to know who we were before we even introduced ourselves. So we were again told that my son was fine and that he was going to be taken to a local hospital for testing. So I said, well, if he's fine, why is he being taken to a hospital? So they kind of brushed us off in what I call like a drive-by meeting. But one young lady held back, and she said she was a psychologist, actually an intern, and she says, well, I can talk to you a little bit more because I don't work for the Bureau of Prisons. And she said that she had seen my son several weeks earlier, and he appeared to be perfectly fine, but the day before, and she kind of demonstrated that he was walking like kind of shaky and stiff, and she advised us to stay on them and make sure that he was given medical care. And finally I got frustrated, and I took off work and I stayed home and I wrote letters and I faxed them to everybody. Television stations, congressmen, senators. I even faxed one to the White House. And this went on for several days, and finally a congressman from Queens, New York got involved, and he was getting the same answers that we were getting. Well, hold on, we'll get somebody to speak to you, and after holding on for 20 minutes, they would come back and say, well, that person is not available, so we asked to speak to somebody else. and we would hold on, and then all of a sudden we'd get a dial tone. They would hang up on us. Well, finally, the congressman got a little frustrated, and he threatened to go to the media. And that's when I was told that my son had been taken to Rochester, Minnesota, to the Federal Medical Center. And went to speak to him. He opened up his eyes, and he looked at me, and he rolled his eyes, almost as if he was angry at me. So I'm saying, well, what's the matter, son? And then I noticed that his eyes just continued to roll around in his head. I'm not sure if he heard me, but it was obvious that he didn't see me. It was like he was trying to focus his eyes. I had several questions, but I was told again, you have to speak to the prison doctors, you can't speak to the hospital doctors, and at that point they had moved him to the Mayo Clinic. And in my hotel room, I got a call from some person from the Bureau of Prisons that told me that my son had AIDS. So the next morning, they had rounds, and there were several doctors there, and I asked them, what is happening to my son? So one doctor took my hand, and he said, ma'am, your son is dying, and the process has already started. So I was like shocked, and I asked him, well, what is he dying from? People don't die from AIDS. They die from some kind of secondary, an infection, pneumonia. And he looked at me like surprised, and he said, AIDS? Well, why would you say that? And I said, because they told me that he had AIDS. And he said, they who? And before I could say anything else, the correction officer that was there jumped up, and she says, I told you that you're not supposed to speak to these doctors, and you have to speak to the prison doctor, and if you say another word to these doctors, you'll be removed from this hospital, and you won't be allowed back in. So, I wanted to be with my son. I didn't want to break the rules. I just wanted to spend what turned out to be his last moments with him. And I hugged him, and I kissed him, and I told him that I always thought he belonged to me, but then I knew that he didn't belong to me, that he belonged to God, and God had lent him to me, and that he was taking him back. And that I was so happy for the time that I was allowed to be with him. And I hugged him, and I kissed him, and I told him goodbye, and I left. One young woman told me that my son was not being fed, he was being hydrated, he was in a coma, and that they didn't have time to give me a daily update, that I can call once or twice a week. And then one morning, I received a call from an official from the Bureau of Prisons, and he said that my son, since he had less than a year to live, that they had a program called the Compassionate Release Program, that he could be sent home if I agreed to care for him, which of course I did. And then he said, well, he would start the paperwork. So I hung up, and I was so happy, and I said, well, even though he's not going to live, maybe, he could come home. And I called everybody in my family, and I asked them to please pray for him to hang on long enough to just come home. And then 20 minutes later, I got a call saying my son had passed away. So they sent him home. And when I got his death certificate, it said he was a male white Mexican. And from that day, I've been fighting to change the drug wars and the prison system and the criminal and justice system as a whole.